The Thing in the River, submitted by Road 2000. After listening to your channel for a while, I realized you are from my neck of the woods. My story comes from a place that you no doubt know, and most other people probably would recognize too. Niagara Falls. I'm an avid fisherman, have been since I was a little kid. And growing up in my town of Wilson, I spent a lot of time on the lakes and rivers here, including a lot of fly fishing on the lower Niagara River. I was lucky to have an uncle who had a home right on the river, and I got to use his waterfront to fish whenever I wanted to. Alright, let me explain. This is not a super rural area. It's a little south of Youngstown, if anyone wants to look it up. On this day, I was up early, around 4 a.m. I'd gotten into a fight with my then-girlfriend the night before and wanted to figure out if I was going to break up with her or not. She had cheated on me, by the way. I got my stuff together and headed down to my uncle's place with some Timmy Hoes on the way there and was ready to just chill, have some coffee, do some fishing. I thought about going to one of the public areas along the river, but I just decided I needed to be alone and quiet. When the sun came up, and this was in October, I decided to take a break and just sat on a folding camping chair that I always brought along. I caught a couple of cohos and then decided to take a smoke break, and as I was just sitting, thinking, smoking, drinking coffee, I noticed something off to my side. In my peripheral vision, I saw this dark shape moving on the rocks about 50 feet away from me. At first I thought, bear. I mean, we have had black bears kind of wander up here from the New York-Pennsylvania border on more than one occasion. And honestly, it's kind of neat how they sneak through the neighborhoods with sightings, but also their disappearances, and people never really being able to find them. Anyway, this thing clearly wasn't a bear. After I swung my head over to look at it, I realized that it certainly was not a bear. It was smashing what I think was a coho against a rock and then began to eat it. I think everyone who's listening to this is hip to what I'm talking about by this time. This was either a man in a gorilla suit or Bigfoot. And what I thought immediately was that it was someone just screwing around. But then it stood up and started looking around the area. It turned and looked at me, and the most remarkable thing that I can say about it was, even as far away as it was its eyes. They were so human, but so not human at the same time. When it realized I was sitting there, this thing screamed at me, this ungodly shriek, and I backed up and slipped into the water. Now, this part of the river isn't like the whirlpools and the rapids section of the Niagara River, but it's still very fast-moving. As I staggered to get up, I fell back again into the water, a little bit deeper, and I started being carried downstream, and I went right past this thing. As I was fumbling about, I shot right by it and got one last look as it turned and scrambled away up the side of the bank. After about another 50 yards or so, I got back onto land and then kind of just sat there stunned. Not only because I had seen that thing, but also because I'd fell into the drink and it was cold. During the entire process, I lost my favorite fly rod too. After a few seconds, I got my bearings and then ran as fast as I could back to my uncle's house. On the way, I heard the thing scream again. By the time I got back, my uncle was in his backyard. I told him everything and asked what the heck that was. He said he didn't see anything, he had just heard it. And years later, I heard about a few reports of Bigfoot in this area, but never heard or saw anything like that again. I don't know what scared me more, the fact that this giant thing could have ripped me apart, or that I fell into the river and could have drowned. It's still the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. The Boy in the Cemetery, submitted by Otis McN. When I was 13 years old, around 1995, I would often travel from my home across town to my friend Matt's house. The quickest way would see me cutting through one of the several local cemeteries in our town of Windsor Locks, Connecticut. This one was called St. Mary's Cemetery, and it's located on Spring Street. One particular day, however, Matt and I were at my house, and we decided in a spur of the moment to head to a restaurant nearby his house that was owned by a classmate of ours family. Him being a buddy, he would often give us free pizza slices near their 10 o'clock closing time. So there we were, two teenagers cutting through a cemetery at close to 10 p.m. at night. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement and turned my head slightly in that direction. And what did I see but a little kid ducking behind a headstone? "There's a kid following us," I said quietly to Matt, and I gestured behind me. He looked and saw the crown of the kid's head popping up from behind the headstone and said, "I'm going to continue walking. How about you sneak around and scare the crap out of him?" I smiled and nodded. I hung back and took a wide berth in the hopes of jumping the kid and giving him a real fright. However, as I swung around and quietly approached, I found the space behind the headstone totally empty. Confused, I stood up and shouted to Matt, "He's gone!" As Matt approached, his eyes went wide and his mouth hung open in shock. He pointed to the front of the headstone I was behind. Moving around to the front, I saw what he was pointing to, an embedded photograph in the stone behind acrylic of a young boy, the very same boy, mind you, that had been following us, complete with the same haircut. Needless to say, we booked it out of the cemetery as fast as we could, and as we ran, I swear to you, I heard laughter behind us. Psycho at Work, submitted by Airwolf. I'm a mechanic, and been so for 30 years now. I've worked in a lot of places, some of the big-name shops, some smaller shops, and now on my own place. The other day I was listening to your channel, and something happened between two of my younger employees, and it reminded me of something that went down back in the early 90s. I was blessed to inherit a set of high-end tools from my dad, who was also a mechanic, but had to retire due to arthritis. So I know the value of being a good mechanic and also having the box to get things done right. Last week, I had a new guy I had hired try to steal some things from one of my other employees, and this all came back to me. When I was 21, I got a job at a local garage in my rural town in Nebraska. I'd made a name for myself by working for my dad and doing jobs for people on the side while putting myself through trade school. Because my dad left me 2 chests of Snap-on stuff, and my skills, I was kind of a sought-after guy. The day I got hired at this place, my dad was so proud. He bought me a Leatherman to always keep in my pocket. I still have it, but I almost lost it to this nut I'll call Keith. Keith was about 10 years older than me, and from the minute go of my job, he had this huge chip. Total asshole. I would see him trying to take stuff out of my boxes all the time. I'd be on a creeper doing something and see his boots going over to my area, and I'd slide out and ask him what he needed, trying to be cool. I always let him borrow whatever, but it got to be a pain always watching him go for my stuff. One night, the boss was heading out and I was still working. He told me to knock off, but I told him I wanted to finish this job, and he was cool with me staying late and just said, "Hey, lock up." He took off, and I went back to work. And then I heard footsteps and looked over to see boots to my side. I was doing a simple job with jack and stands, no need for a lift. But I heard Keith's voice say something like, "What would you do if I kicked the jams and let the jack go?" Squish. He actually made the noise squish like, "Quack." I shot out on the creeper, and he had the craziest look on his face. I didn't say anything, and then he just walked out the door. After a minute, I lowered the bay door where I was, locked it and the other doors, just really freaked out. I quickly finished up, did the Gojo thing with my hands to get most of the grease and stuff off, and was ready to leave. And that's when I saw Keith pressing himself up against the little glass window of the bay door I was working at. Again, the scary shit-eating grin. We stared at each other, and then he left, and I heard him drive away. I shook my head, locked up, and went home. That was a Thursday night, and my boss told me the next day that Keith had called in sick. He asked me if I could get some of my work done and some of Keith's jobs done, and I got down to things and did them. And the man told me I could leave early after working late the night before. I was super happy to be able to scoot out early. Around noon, Keith showed up. He walked into the garage, called me a fag, tried to take my Leatherman off my bench, and then yelled at my boss that he wanted his paycheck and that he was quitting. He was sweating bullets and looked totally crazy, and my boss told him to calm down and then go into his little office that he had, but Keith screamed, "No! Give me my effing paycheck!" He went over to his little tool chest and wheeled it out to his crappy truck while the rest of us just stood watching him. 2 other guys were there too. It wasn't payday, and my boss did the right thing. He opened his wallet, gave Keith cash, and told him to beat it and to not come back. Keith then ran at my bench and tried to grab my Leatherman again. And when I snatched it up, he looked at me dead in the eye and said, "Boy, you gonna pay." I've been in fights before, but the look on his face, the way he was sweating, man, I was scared. He tipped his toolbox into his truck bed and then took off. I mean, he didn't secure anything. He just took off, screeching the tires. I did leave early that day, and as I was making my way home, I still lived with my parents, blow me, I stopped at a gas station to pick up a couple of 6-packs of Bud. I slowed down when I saw Keith's truck in the lot and figured, all right, the hell with this guy. I was just there to buy some chewing beer and I'd be on my way quickly. I had my Leatherman on the seat of my Chevy, and I ran in, but not quick enough. When I came out, I saw Keith reaching into my cab, and he grabbed my tool and then ran to his truck. He took off, and I whipped my stuff into my truck and then followed him. He tried to lose me over and over again, but finally cut down an old dirt road that I knew was a dead end. Dead end sounds kind of eerie to me now. When he finally got to the dead end, Keith parked and jumped out with the blade section of my own tool. He was pointing it at me. He was waving it in the air and screaming names at me. And when he got close to my truck, he started stabbing it at my grill. I yelled at him to knock it off, to just give him my Leatherman back and I'd let things go. Did he listen? No. He kept walking at me, so I reached behind my seat for this baseball bat handle I have on a string. I said, "Hey, dude, I don't want to fight. Just give me my shit and that's it." Keith stood there staring for a moment and then jumped at me one more time. I swung the bat at the same time that he was reaching for me, and I cracked him right on his elbow, and with a scream, he dropped my Leatherman and sat down hard holding his arm. I quickly snagged my Leatherman and jumped back into my truck and threw it in reverse and blew out of there. I raced home, got my truck in the back, and shut the chain-link gate we had across our driveway. I went inside, grabbed one of my beers that I had bought, and collapsed on a kitchen chair. Both of my parents came in and asked what was wrong, and I told them the whole story. Everything was over, or so I thought. That night I was watching TV, and I heard a vehicle blasting up the street. My dad and I went to the window and saw Keith's vehicle driving across our neighbors' lawns, and then he stopped right on ours. "How do you like this, fag?" Keith screamed out the window, and he jammed on the gas and left deep ruts in our grass. I mean, he held it there, digging deeper while screaming more names at me and my dad. Finally, he jolted forward, hopped over the curb, slammed into my neighbor's car before heading straight into a tree across the street. Was he done? Nope. Keith got out, his head all bloodied. He was still sweating like he was in a steam room, and he was still screaming. He stumbled around in circles, calling everyone who had now come out of their homes to see what was going on, and my mom called the police. They showed up right as Keith was falling onto his knees, still yelling. Paramedics showed up, and they got him into an ambulance and took him away. I told the police everything that had gone down, and that it all had stemmed from him wanting my Leatherman. One cop smiled and said, "No, I think it's his PCP habit that he started all of this for." Seems Keith had warrants out, including FTAs for drug-related offenses. Pretty soon, a tow truck came out, the police cleaned up the mess, and the night went back to normal. I know Keith went to the pokey, but a few years later, after my dad died and my mom moved to Florida, I moved to Oklahoma City, where I still live. I hope that guy got the help that he needed, and maybe he is hopefully leading a productive life somewhere, somehow. Maybe even Keith finally got his own Leatherman. Cult in the Woods, submitted by Anonymous. This is a story about the time me and a buddy went looking for a cult. The story takes place a few years ago when I was in high school, and the names have been changed. I live in a very small town in eastern Oklahoma. It's a very rural area with a lot of Native American history and people. It all started one day when me and my buddy Bucky decided to go drive around because there's not much else to do in a small town. At the time, me and Bucky were around 17 years old, so we were young and reckless, looking for something to do, which led us somewhere we had no business being. It was a late summer evening, and we were out driving around just our normal roads, and then we decided to go up the mountain. It wasn't really a mountain, just a way of saying back into the more rural part of town. On our way up, we drove past my girlfriend at the time, which made me feel better because she knows there's no service up there, so she wouldn't be expecting to hear from me. While we were heading up the mountain, we drove by a lot of run-down houses, and we already knew we'd made a bad decision. As we entered the Native American community, everyone was sitting out on their front porches just staring at us. But nonetheless, we ignored it and kept going. At this point, we had very spotty service on our phones, and Bucky asked me, "Have you ever heard of Elohim City?" And I told him, "No, I haven't." He then began to tell me all these stories of this city that's been supposedly involved with things like human trafficking and the Oklahoma City bombing. At that time, we decided to do more research on where it was, so I used Bucky's phone to research the best I could with the spotty service. I found some pictures of odd dome-shaped buildings with their own airstrip within the gated compound. As we traveled the winding roads, we hit several dead ends. When we were starting to lose hope, we came across a road that looked as if it led to the compound. We turned onto the unknown road, and Bucky pointed out a large rock to the left that had the quote, "Jesus Saves" on it, in white. That was odd due to the fact there was nothing surrounding it but woods, and that led us to believe that we were close to the compound because we knew the people were cultists and believed that they were God's chosen people. As the sun started to set, we saw crows flying above us, and it just gave us a very uneasy feeling. While we were driving down the road, I almost had a heart attack when I looked to my right and saw what I thought was two heads on a post, but to my surprise they were just Halloween masks. We had a very strong feeling we shouldn't be there, and contemplated turning around, but Bucky was determined to find this compound. We came to a three-way stop at which we turned left seemingly in the direction of the compound. As we started down the road, we came to a sudden stop once we saw an all-white horse with no saddle or bridle, just standing in the middle of the road. To many people, this wouldn't seem strange, but to me and Bucky, we knew it could symbolize death. We sat there petrified, and we looked past the horse to see the compound. That's when Bucky turned to me and said, "Fuck this, we're leaving." I agreed, so we turned around and hauled ass out of there. As we headed away from the compound, we saw a large pentagram painted on a culvert just past the large rock that said "Jesus Saves." And that was really the final straw. Bucky pushed his 96 Ranger to the limit down the winding roads back to a gas station. Once at the gas station, we went inside and grabbed some drinks and snacks, and then we called our girlfriends at the time and explained to them everything that had happened. It just so happens that my girlfriend's friend, whom she was with right then, lived in the area near the compound. She told her stories of children being abducted, them being a white supremacist group with ties to the KKK, and that they still had a bunker with a large arsenal of weapons and illegal drugs. After that phone call, Bucky and I both made the decision to never return there again. The Trailer, submitted by Frank. I grew up on the edge of a suburb of a town that had a lot of great friends, and this is a messed up story about something that happened to us one day in the middle of summer. We never even saw it coming. We were just being kids. We used to play pickup ball at this field next to a farmer's cornfield. Mr. Jackson was a great guy and let us play there even though it was his land, and sometimes he'd even stop working and throw a few pitches. He tried to leave the farm when he was a kid and played double-A ball for a while, but it never worked out. Between his land and the rest of our neighborhood was this vacant lot that had a lot of junk on it. Piles of concrete, rebar, all kinds of junk. When I look back on it, I think it was kind of a place that the town just left stuff from projects from here and there. I'm going to get right to the chase. After playing some ball, me and two buddies were heading home and cut through that lot. I'll call them Jason and Tom, two names that just came up in my head. That's not their real names. Walking behind the piles of concrete and all the other junk, we noticed something we hadn't noticed before. A trailer. Like one of those old coachman trailers, maybe 25 feet long or so. I mean, something that families would go camping in. I asked my buddies if they had ever seen it before, and none of us had. I mean, we cut through there all the time, and sometimes even hung out there to smoke cigarettes and do the stuff that 13-year-old kids do out of parental vision. But nobody had ever seen it before. It had just shown up in the past week as far as we knew. Of course, we wanted to check it out, but also kept in mind that it might be some kind of office shack or something for the town, as this was on their land. We walked up to the trailer, and to our surprise, the door was kind of pried off its hinges a bit, and wasn't closed totally properly. Or maybe it just couldn't close right, who knows. It didn't look like anyone else was around, so I went up and knocked on the door. My dad's friend worked for the Department of Works, and my pea-brain thought that maybe he was inside working on some project. But when no one answered, Jason said, "Hey, let's go in." So we opened the door and went in, and it smelled really bad. I mean, not like rotting stuff, just like really old and musty. And there were boxes piled up high on the floor, on all the tables, all the counters, and they were mostly shoe boxes. There were also two computers on a table as well. I mean, those big old desktop towers. I mean, this was 1998. Jason opened one of the boxes and just said, "Oh, Jesus." So me and Tom went over to see what he was looking at, and we both said the same thing. The box was full of pictures and Polaroids of naked men. And Jason slammed the lid closed, and I grabbed another box, being curious. More of the same, but this one was of women and men doing all kinds of sexual stuff. Tom said we should leave right now, and Jason said, "Hey, all these boxes have some kind of labels." But, I mean, he was right, but no difference. We knew we shouldn't be there anymore. Jason still went on and grabbed another box, and this one had stuff I don't even want to talk about it. But I guess it's called BDSM. Curiosity got the cat, and I poked around too, and there was a whole other bunch of boxes with VHS tapes. The one I will always remember was called The Domination of Tammy. For whatever reason, that always sticks out in my mind when I remember this. Just then we heard tires crackling on gravel. Someone was driving up to the trailer. Like idiots, we had left the door open. Tom went to look out, and he said that there was this beat-up old Bronco pulling up to the trailer. And then he said, "2 guys are getting out of that truck." The windows all had blankets over them, so we couldn't see out, but we knew we were in deep. We heard a voice say something like, "Hey, Al, somebody's in there." And then there was silence. After a minute, there was another voice that called out, "We can see you looking out the door, you little prick. Get out here." Tom froze, and we heard doors shutting and the sound of footsteps. And then Tom said, "This guy has a gun." And he tried to shut the door. It closed as far as it did when we got there, still broken. Okay, what do we do?" I asked out loud. The guys outside started laughing and said for us to come out with our hands up, and that we were going for a ride. Another thing that stands out in my mind. What did they mean by that? Jason went to the end of the trailer where there was a bathroom. It had a little crank-out window. The guys outside kept saying to come out, and I finally yelled at them and said, "Just leave us alone, we'll scram." They laughed and said it was too late for that. By now, Jason was hissing at us to follow him and to try to crawl out this window in the bathroom. That's when one of the guys came over and started to open the door. I hadn't noticed that Tom had put a piece of wood through the door handle, and the guy couldn't open the door all the way. The guy started yelling again, and through a crack in the opening, I could see part of his face. He looked angry, and he had a really cheesy mustache. Tom kicked the door, and suddenly there was a clicking noise. The door was shut properly, with the piece of wood still in the handle as an extra. The two of us moved to the back of the trailer in time to see Jason crawling out of the window. The guys were still outside, banging on the door, yelling for us to open it. We followed Jason out, and after falling on our faces, all three of us got up and ran for the edge of the lot and climbed a big fence into another lot. The guys obviously heard us, and they came running, but we were already halfway through the other lot before we turned to look at them. One guy had a shotgun, and both were now just kind of standing at the fence looking really, really mad. I said, "Let's just get out of here," and we hightailed it back to my house where we told my mom and dad what had happened. My dad called the cops and then went to meet them at the entrance of the lot. We went along with him and sat in the back of my dad's car. The cops showed up, and so did Mr. Jackson, too. The trailer was still hidden behind the piles of concrete, but when the cops came back, they said there were only a couple of boxes of pictures, much like we described, but everything else was gone. We all got yelled at for playing in the lot, and the cops told us that even if it was abandoned, it was illegal for us to be in the trailer in the first place. Like what had happened to us was no big deal, and that everything was our fault. Even now when I think back on this, I wonder what that guy meant by him taking us for a ride. I shudder to think. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I hope you liked it. If you have a true scary story you'd like to hear narrated on this channel, email unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification button and leave a comment. I always respond to them as fast as I can. You can also follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. And if you are looking to save on bandwidth, you can find me on all of your favorite podcasting platforms. We're coming up close on Halloween, and I'm asking for your submissions for your craziest, scariest Halloween stories. It's one of my favorite things to put together every year, and I know you will not disappoint me, and I've got some cool stuff in the hopper already. Looking forward to putting that together for you all. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.